you've got to focus on really the basics, right? I mean, you've got to have the process outlined. You've got to have the team trained. You have to have the system set up. Otherwise, I mean, you're tracking garbage data and then you're making decisions off of that data.
What's your take on ops, and how's your life impacted it, either through your work or even, whatever else you've been doing in this world?
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of ties into how I got into ops, but I started out in sales. I was customer facing for a while, and there was always something that was like sort of missing. I always wanted to be dealing with numbers and analyzing stuff and focused on process and projects and things like that. So um, I sort of stumbled into the sales operations role. I made a leap going from this very safe job, working at like a Fortune 100 company, not really making a ton of money, but I had the benefits and all this good stuff. I did that, and then I made the leap into a startup. And I would say, I mean, that was my first experience working on the ops side. I would say we moved so fast at that startup that we sort of just rammed stuff down people's throats, right? I mean, we were growing like triple digit growth, and there was a goal. We ultimately, exited and got acquired. So I would say initially that was my perspective on ops. And I think in time, some life experience has sort of tied into that as well, where you can't just always cram stuff down people's throats. There is a human element, and there's a way to do things and get them done effectively. And I think I sort of tie that back to how I grew up. So I'm actually a dual citizen of the US and Germany. My mom's German, dad's American, was in the Army, got stationed over there. So I think my whole life, I've always had two perspectives on how things could work, And so I think it's really easy in ops to get into this feeling of like there's a single way to do it, and this is the process, and this is how it has to be done. But like if I take a step back and I look at like, well, the way things public transportation works in Germany is very different from how it works in the US, which is almost non-existent, But in Germany, they have this great network of public transit and things like that. So I try to always, I guess, twofold, consider that like the one way that I saw how to do something isn't always the best way, or the way that you read that Salesforce put out a report or Marketo put out a report. Like, it's not always a single way to do things. And then you cannot forget the human element of operations, right? Like, you're at the end of the day, you're dealing with tech and systems and processes, but it all boils down to like people, and can they adopt it? Can they understand it? Can they implement it? Can they report on it? I think it all ties together, and I think some life experiences have played into understanding that. And my evolution of how I think about ops has really gone from like, you're going to do whatever we tell you and we're going to cram it down your throat, to trying, finessing a little bit more and having an understanding of the nuances that are involved throughout.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Now, you raised some good themes there, and I do have a question, but I wanted to do a check to make sure it's the right question. Would you describe logically as, a fast growth SaaS company?
So we're not a SaaS company.
Yeah.
We do have a recurring revenue component, but
Yeah.
So we're managed IT managed services firm. So we sell like one-time projects, we sell recurring service work, and then also sell products. So we're a little bit different than most SaaS companies, although there are elements of SaaS within the business.
Yeah. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you for that context. It helps, because we know ops, like you said, it can always look different. So it's helpful to understand the background now.
Absolutely.
You did raise a good point, ramming things down people's throats and the pressure to grow quickly. This is the life of a startup, and it's one lots of people in ops experience. Now, how do you combine and walk the tightrope between the pressure to grow and the pressure to build process with the speed at which that has to happen, and then also tying in the ability to actually take a step back and be effective in the way you described. Is that a maturity thing? Or is there actually fundamental skills people can learn to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's experience tends to be a great teacher, right? So if you can learn from somebody else's mistakes, I think that helps, right? So um, for me, it's really getting the foundation built properly. So if you think about it, almost like building a house, right? Like you're not putting in the kitchen counters before you've put up the walls, and you're not putting the walls up before you've poured the foundation, right? Sometimes it's a little bit easier said than done. I mean, I think in some cases, if you have private equity or outside capital, there's a little bit more pressure from the outside pushing that growth. But I think most people get it, right? Like you have to have the foundation in place before you can start doing all these other things. And it doesn't help to move at 1,000,000 miles per hour to get all this stuff built if you haven't laid the foundation of what is the process? What are we trying to measure? How are we going to measure it? You know, that kind of stuff. So I think it definitely can be learned. I think it's harder to do when you're a little bit more junior, like you don't have the experience. You're probably not as comfortable pushing back on your leadership team and things like that. But, you know, I know in a previous role that I was in, it was like, we need to do these 10,000 things. And it's like, okay, first of all, we need to lay the foundation. We have to figure out what's our process, build the CRM out, make sure we can track, and then we can add in the DocuSigns and the LinkedIn sales nav and the sales, you know, that kind of stuff. I think if you're building for the long term, it's a little bit easier to sell that story of like, hey, let's get it right. So 3 years from now, we don't have to do this all over again. So yeah, I think it's a combination of experience, painting that long-term picture of getting it right and laying the foundation. And then from there, it is a bit of a tightrope act at the same time, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is fantastic. A good question for you, Stefanie, is because you've been in this role now for 2 months. You started in October at Logically. And you raise a good point there. You need to basically surface what needs fixing and where before you go mental.
Yeah.
So for someone walking into a role for their first 2 months, 6 months, what's your process in doing that? What's your process to analyzing where the process is needed?
Absolutely. So this is a really good question because I'm literally in the middle of this right now. So,
Yeah.
you know, part of it is starting to dig in and just become familiar with the system. How does this work? Do we have documentation on how it's supposed to work? Oh, it was last updated 5 years ago. Uh, you know, or it was updated 5 days ago. Great. You know, you can start digging into that.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, though, the biggest thing is just talking to people, right? It's talking to people. It's understanding where have we been? Where did we come from? How have things been evolving over these last few months? Where are the big roadblocks? What are the big problem issues? Um, it's a lot of conversations. I personally have just been trying to do a lot of listening, right? Asking good questions, listening, show me how to do this kind of stuff. I know I've been on, you know, some calls where I'm just like, okay, that sounds pretty good. And then I've been on other calls where I'm like, this is how we do it, you know? So just sort of understanding that and being able to walk through it, that starts to give you the ability to think about how you could fix things. But more than that is like, you don't want to be the outsider coming in and like, all right, I know everything about your business. I've been here 6 weeks, you know. You have to do the listening, you have to get input, you have to build rapport, you have to understand the process, the systems, where we've been, where we're going. And then from there, you can start to sell your ideas or you know, what are next steps? How do we improve? How do we fix these bottlenecks? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, that last point is a crucial one, resistance to change. But before we get onto that, I'd imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that when you are listening, perhaps sometimes you see different interpretations of an issue or
Sure.
people paint different landscapes. I would imagine this makes it challenging for a new person to understand what the real, you know, idea is here.
Mhm.
So how do you reach a level of objectivity when you're having different accounts? And how do you still make people feel that they're included in the process when you might come to a different conclusion or perhaps when you've heard a different tale of events?
Sure. So, I mean, I think as far as parsing out which view is maybe the correct or most objective view, um, I think if you start talking to enough people, that tends to show itself, right? So you may have one or two people who have different perspectives, um, but over time, as you're aggregating all that information and insights, you start to catch on to the story, right? As far as what's correct. I think it's also important to hit all the different levels within an organization, because like your C-level folks are going to have a different, they have a much broader view, the bigger picture kind of view of like, yeah, this has always been a problem, or this is why, this particular person that we, hired 5 years ago impacted the business in this way. So they have like the top level big picture kind of overview. And then as you get down into the organization within like the ranks of like individual contributors, they're going to be the ones that call out the issues in the day to day. And they might have some of that big picture uh, details as well, but maybe not the full story, right? And so I think you have to parse that out a little bit based on, what's the role? How long has this person been here? Do they know the history? But over time, you have enough conversations, you really start to pull out what's actually going on. I forgot the second part of your question, but it was sort of a two-parter.
Yeah, well, I actually think it's a really conclusive and it's a good answer. And actually, I already had a question based on that, because
Okay.
it's interesting, right? Like you said, C-level will have an interpretation, they'll have an overview, they'll have the strategy. People on the ground, it might be more tactical, and of course, they'll be more involved with their own life, their own day-to-day.
Mhm.
Is it important? Is it an important piece of work to communicate what's happening at the top level down to the floor? How do you navigate perhaps what might sometimes be in some worlds maybe a politically charged atmosphere in that way?
Mhm.
And yeah, really just talk to me about that angle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the second part of your question was around like how do you get the team involved and make sure that they feel heard, right? So this sort of ties into that as well. Um, I'm a huge proponent of like as much transparency as possible, um, with the caveat of like you don't want to like overburden your team, like your individual contributors. You don't want to overburden them with all the details and all the stuff that's swirling around. So I mean, I think you want to loop them in on conversations as to like what's going on big picture wise. What are our plans for next year? Are we hiring? Are we not hiring? Are we going to invest in training? Are we going to fix broken processes? That kind of stuff. I mean, I, as an individual contributor, always like to hear that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And then if I had thoughts or if the team has thoughts, then you can always like pull them in and get their input as well, which addresses the issue of being the new person who's maybe coming in and just throwing out a bunch of commands. It's really about that rapport and establishing the relationships and figuring out like how do we keep the team involved and engaged, um, at the same time, not overburdening too much with all the nitty gritty details. So again, I like to keep them in the loop and keep communicating with them on the things that they need to know so they are confident in the direction of the company. They can ask questions. I like to keep that open line of communication.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I think you've given a great account of the human to human component necessary in process adoption, which is really important.
Yeah.
But let's also move on to the data, because that's important too.
Right.
So give me your view. Where is data important? Is data important? And then we can build from there.
Absolutely. So, I mean, as an ops person, my answer has to be yes,
Yeah.
So, I mean, the data is very important. I think the focus is, for me, the data doesn't really mean a lot if it's not, if there's not a consistent process or it's not captured in a way that's effective for tracking and things like that. So going back to the foundation piece, it's really, you've got to focus on really the basics, right? I mean, you've got to have the process outlined, you've got to have the team trained, you have to have the system set up. Otherwise, I mean, you're tracking garbage data and then you're making decisions off of that data. So then you're like, yeah, we're data driven. We make all our decisions off of data. And at the same time, it's like, well, your data is terrible, So yes, love data, but you have to actually collect it in a way that allows you to use the data effectively, right? Like, it's not just checking a box to say, oh yeah, we run these weekly reports and we have all these KPIs and the, you know, greens and the yellows and the reds and all that. It's like, well, does the data actually mean what you think it means? Like, is it actually telling you the story? And I think it's easy to get lost in that sometimes. So got to have the foundation in place. And then absolutely, yes, the data does matter.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love that story about, we've probably all been there when we've looked at our own data or a company's data and thought, actually, this isn't so great. And it's a great piece to, again, come back to entering a new organization, getting your head around that data. I'd imagine there's a bit of a mountain to climb there. So what's your advice to people for beginning that hike?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's pretty similar. It obviously depends on the kind of systems you have as well. So, I mean, for me, being able to actually visualize the data is a huge one, right? Like, oftentimes you're like, you get these lists or like Excel spreadsheets that just have rows and rows and rows of data, and you're like, okay, I can't really figure out what's going on here. So, I mean, I think it's a big part of like understanding the process. How are we collecting the data, but then also being able to visualize it. And that's where you can start to spot some trends, right? Like, oh, we just had a massive uptick in the number of opportunities that are being created. What happened? Oh, we hired 6 new salespeople. Okay, that makes sense. Well, if we didn't hire 6 new salespeople, why did it go up? You know, so you can start digging into that once you visualize the data. I would say that's a huge one. And again, sometimes you start looking at the data and it's not telling you the right story because you're not interpreting it correctly. So also having some conversation around that, like, this seems a little weird. What's going on there? Oh, we changed processes 6 months ago, you know, something like that, where all of a sudden your data is skewed or there's big jumps or gaps or something like that. So, you know, again, just super important to understand the foundation, the process. How does it all get there? How can we visualize it? And then on top of that, just making sure like you do a gut check with some of the people who probably know the data a little bit better outside of the spreadsheet.
Yeah, actually, I'd add to that, because what we're talking about as well here is the narrative behind the data, or the picture that the data is creating.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you bring it up. You know, we can all sit in a boardroom and have 3 different interpretations of what data means. Revenue ops, what most people talk about is aligning the revenue function, and that means aligning people around the data and the metrics. So I'm really interested to hear from you. How do we get to a single interpretation of the data? Or is that a detriment to an organization? Would that take away people's kind of creativity? What's your view on that?
That's a good question. I think you do have to get all the teams aligned, right? You have to clarify the definitions. If you say new logo, what does that mean? If you say MQL, what does that mean? Like, if you're in stage 3 of your sales cycle, what does that mean? Like, what has happened? What should you be doing now? I think it's hugely important. I think actually a lot of companies don't do this well, right? From my experience. Maybe that's me living in a bubble, but I think a lot of companies have a tough time of just really setting clear standards and definitions and then getting the team bought in on it. But it's hugely important, because if you're not all in agreement, if I think stage 3 is I'm doing a demo and you think you're negotiating a proposal, like, we're so far apart on the spectrum, it's really tough to make decisions or run the business, or even just like bring new people on, right? Like, if everybody has a new definition or a different definition, it just creates a lot of cloudiness and confusion, and people don't really know what they're aiming for at that point.
Yeah, superb. I wanted to circle back to something, because you're mentioning CRMs, you're mentioning Excel, and for me, a really interesting part of RevOps or sales ops is that it's growing with the tools around it. We're able to stand on the mountains that the tools create. So for me, double-edged question: what are the essential tools you need, and what can you get from those that a human couldn't possibly do? But on the reverse, what are the core competencies you need regardless of the tool? What do you need as a RevOps, sales ops person to be able to do this job?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, from a tool perspective, I think the easy answer is CRM. Everybody goes to Salesforce, almost everybody. So we actually use Dynamics, which is a bit of a change for me here. But yeah, I mean, I would start with that you've got to get the CRM. That's the foundation, and everything else is sort of plugged into that. Once you've gotten that established, obviously some sort of like marketing automation platform, and then you can start digging into some prospecting tools or other automation components. So like the ones that come to mind for me would be, for ease of getting a deal done, like a DocuSign or e-signature tool, prospecting tool, probably like a LinkedIn sales nav, outbound cadence tool, probably a sales loft or outreach kind of thing would probably be like my first set of tools.
Mm.
I mean, what do the tools bring to you? I mean, it's sort of like the visualization piece I just mentioned, right? You can have a list of all this stuff as a human, but the beauty of the tool is it can prompt you to dig in, right? So if you can see your data in a way that's like, oh, I have these deals closing and, in 2 days I'm in stage 1, probably not going to happen, right? Or I haven't logged in activity on this deal that's supposed to close next week. I better follow up. That kind of stuff. I mean, we're just not good at that as humans, right? It's just information overload where it's almost impossible to keep up with it. So, I mean, I think the benefit of these tools is less to think about from your individual standpoint, but B, I mean, they just do all the stuff that nobody wants to do: schedule follow-ups, close stuff out, and send out automated emails, canned emails for, you can personalize it and clean that stuff up and all that. Humans are good at that, but just the rote work that goes into managing your day-to-day, being able to see the big picture, the forest for the trees. You can't really beat it. It's one of those things where it's like technology and humans come together. You do the human part and let the system do the system, the automation, and the stuff that we're just not good at doing.
I really liked what you said there. Yeah, let the technology do the technological part, the process part.
Yeah, it's like all the stuff you don't like, right?
Yeah, all the stuff you didn't want to be doing when you got into ops. Which actually raises another great question, because like you said, the big picture stuff, this is the stuff we dream of doing when we get into ops, like either the strategy stuff or like the high level thinking tactical stuff at the same time. So now it's a piece of work though lots of people never get to, because they are stuck in the day to day. They're putting out fires, they're under pressure to create reports, they're running out of time, we're working long hours. So aside from the tools, which are very helpful, how do you build your career and competencies, and what's your kind of general process for finding the time to do big picture stuff? And what do you start seeing as value added as a professional when you're able to, when you do start doing that?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, just thinking back early in my career, you sort of feel like a hamster, just running on the wheel, getting reports and things like that. And there's always this nagging feeling of like, man, I want to be doing more. I want to set some strategy and be more influential. And like, how do we go to market? Who are we targeting? And that kind of stuff. So I really think it boils down to, one is just building up your experience, right? Like, if you're the person that people know they can go to and trust that you're going to put out good work, that elevates you automatically, right? If you're reliable and you're always putting out good work and you're taking on maybe the projects that nobody else wants to do, that's a pretty good start, right? To work your way up. I would say the other thing, I guess a couple more things would be, one is trying to get away from always doing everything for everybody, right? And sort of go the teach a man or woman to fish route, where you can provide the insights, the information, the report, the dashboard, and then teach people how to use it, right? So they don't always have to rely on you. And then that pulls you out of some of the day-to-day, like you'll always have the day-to-day grind kind of stuff that you have to go through. And then my other suggestion would be to try and time block some chunks of your day where you can focus on something different. Maybe you can dig into the numbers a little more and do some of the analysis, or figure out, oh, this process is broken. How would I fix it? And start thinking about some of that kind of stuff. I think it's super important to not always point out just a problem, but also like, how could we solve this problem? And most of the time it's like your next level up is they're like, oh yeah, that is a big problem. We've been talking about it for a while. We just didn't know what to do about it. glad you've been thinking about it. How do we make that happen, right? So sometimes you have to create your own avenues to get out of that grind, the day-to-day grind, and elevate yourself in the position. And a big part of that is just being proactive and being someone that you're reliable, people can count on you. You don't just bring problems, but you bring solutions. I mean, that will skyrocket your career in a hurry because most people don't do it.
Yeah, I think that's good. It's a good reminder in ops because I think you're right. We're trained to think about where the problems are and what the data's saying. But I suppose that next level, that elite level, is thinking, well, what does that mean we should do? So thank you. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that thought, you know, I once had somebody on my team. He was younger, you know, late 20s or something like that. But I mean, we would have these conversations, and I as his manager, you know, I'd be like, well, we got to do this and this and this, and he was just like, that's cool, I'll do it for you, don't worry about it. And I knew I could trust him to do it. And then he'd be like, yeah, I'm just trying to make your life easier. Nobody says that, but it's hugely valuable, you know? So it's like, if I trust him to do this thing, we come back and talk about it, maybe tweak one or two things, I'm always going to trust him to do more and more. That gives him the visibility. It makes my life easier, makes me look good. Like, it's a win-win right there, you know? So it's hugely important to be able to have somebody like that that you can count on from a managerial perspective, but awesome for that person's career as well.
Yeah, I like that. That's fantastic. Just being helpful is a way to progress yourself. It's a good,
surprisingly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's imagine something now. Say you're in a room full of sales and RevOps leaders, like the super people of this world, like so good at it. What would you ask them?
What would I ask them? That's a great question too. I think probably the biggest question, I'd probably try to hit on like biggest lessons learned throughout their careers, right? There's a ton of wisdom in there, as far as, you know, every company is a little bit different. If you work in technology, or maybe you sell a physical product or manage services, you know, everybody's experience is a little bit different. Everybody has run into different roadblocks. If you've worked with a PE firm, it's different than if you're, you know, working at a company that's still run by founders. There's all kinds of different perspectives, I think, that are out there. And if you get people who are humble enough to reflect back on some mistakes that they've made, there are some huge lessons in there. And from my standpoint, I usually try, if I can, this doesn't always work out, but I try to learn from other people's mistakes and save myself from falling into those same traps. So I think a lot of folks, you know, top-notch RevOps, sales ops folks probably have a lot of good stories to share as far as missteps or failures, or if I could do this differently, here's how I would do it. And there's a lot of knowledge to be gained there.